Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Reish, and I welcome you today. Thanks for joining me and Katherine Carter. I am the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society and the Program Director of the National Churchill Leadership Center at George Washington University, where I am right now. So I am joined by Katherine Carter, who is not only a good friend, but also the curator of Chartwell, which is Winston Churchill's family home in Kent. Hi, Katherine.
Hello, Justin. Thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you. So before we kick off, I'd like to remind all of our attendees of a few things. This conversation is being recorded and it will be free to watch on our YouTube page in the coming days. Katherine would love to answer your questions, so please submit them via the Q&A function and we'll get to them later in the conversation. We also encourage you to use the chat function so you can tell us where in the world you're tuning in from today, this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you are. And lastly, Katherine will be sharing historical images on her screen that are meant to be used for this virtual event only. Please do not take screenshots of these images. These images are supplied by Top Photo, and we thank them for allowing us to use these images today. Now let's begin. Katherine, so you're here today joining us to tell us about a new outdoor photography exhibition at Chartwell titled Churchill in the Crown. So first, on behalf of all of us who are not in the UK and can't get to Chartwell often, thank you for doing this because it allows us virtually to really get into the exhibition. Definitely, it's not the same as seeing it in person, but it's very much appreciated. And can I start by asking what inspired you to create this photography exhibition?
Yes, so Justin, I think for me, doing something to celebrate Winston Churchill's relationship with the Queen, given that it is the Platinum Jubilee this year, seemed like a brilliant idea. And it's something that a lot of our visitors to Chartwell are really interested to find out more about. But beyond being Her Majesty the Queen's first Prime Minister, Winston Churchill actually served 6 monarchs in total. So sometimes it's easy to forget the sheer length of his political career takes you right back to the reign of Queen Victoria. So although focusing primarily on Queen Elizabeth II, this exhibition does explore right back to the start of his political career. And for me, the idea of doing it through photographs, it's quite a new one because at Chartwell, of course, we have Winston's home and his beloved possessions, and usually they are the catalyst for the story. So it was a different way of doing it. But I had so much fun pouring through Top Photo's archives. I swear I need to take a holiday there at some point just because they have thousands of photos, all of which are phenomenal. And it was really difficult cherry picking just the ones to use for our exhibition. But they're the ones I'm going to be showing you tonight. And as Justin said, they are courtesy of Top Photo, which is spelt TOPFOTO. And they are an independent photo archive I work with a lot at Chartwell. So I'm hugely indebted to them for their support and enabling us to do this evening.
So you're going to show us all of the photos, and I'll ask you to share your screen shortly to go through them. But for those who are not familiar, tell us what Platinum Jubilee means.
So Platinum Jubilee means that it is 70 years since the Queen's accession to the throne. So it makes her she's the longest serving monarch in British history, which is a phenomenal milestone to reach. And so we are celebrating that here in the UK. And it's lovely for Sir Winston Churchill's home to be able to connect into that with stories related to the Churchill family.
And I'm not going to preempt it too much, but there's a wonderful photo that everyone will see here shortly about becoming the Queen. So do you want to share your screen and we'll start going through the photos and please begin.
Absolutely. So if I just share my screen and click on this one. So can you see that? Is that coming up?
Yes, we can. Yes, we
Perfect.
can.
Okay. So our exhibition kicks off with this image. And the reason I chose it is because, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that Churchill's parliamentary career goes back to Queen Victoria. And there's a lovely element as well of you could recreate this image with Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Charles and Prince William and Prince George. So it's actually the same makeup of monarch and heirs. And for me, this context of Queen Victoria being on the throne at the start of his career is really important because it sort of sets the scene for Churchill's view of the monarchy. The way to look at it is that the monarchy is at this point in its imperial apotheosis, and Queen Victoria has had at that point the longest reign. So it's a very established traditional institution that we have, and it is seen as something that connects the past, the present, and the future. It's this constant, this sort of continuity. And so for Winston Churchill, beginning his career in 1900 with Queen Victoria on the throne, it's interesting as well because he starts his political career as a Conservative. So for the first 4 years, he's a backbench MP for the Conservatives. Quite quickly, he moves across to the Liberal Party, and his relationship with the monarchy changes at that point because he has this reforming zeal that actually puts him at odds in some instances. So, for example, once Edward VII is on the throne, so he's the individual on the top right, there's a disagreement because Winston Churchill wants to take away some funds from the British Army to fund old age pensions, which is a really bold move given that Churchill is a former soldier. And Edward VII objects to this. He then, with George V, who is the following monarch top left, who is on the throne from 1910 onwards, there's a number of disagreements. So, for example, when Churchill is First Lord of the Admiralty, he proposes that a new ship be named HMS Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell having committed regicide, not a terribly popular choice. And there's just a few moments where Churchill isn't showing kind of due deference to the monarchy, and he becomes a bit of a troublemaker, you could say, at that point. So I would have loved to explore that deeper in the exhibition, but I have to be very mindful of, I think I need to write an entire book on this at some point, I've decided. But so that image I've used just to tell that story of what the royal family was at the outset and his interesting, nuanced relationship with those first three monarchs of his political career.
So if I can butt in, ask you two questions. A few people in the chat are wanting you to confirm the little boy, that's Edward VIII, correct?
That is the future Edward VIII, indeed, yes, in that rather brilliant sailor suit.
And I have to say, so this is a question, this is a statement. When I first saw this photo when you sent it to me, George V, if I'm getting it right on the left, and I know you sent me these photos and I knew what your exhibition was about. When I first saw that, I said, is that Lord Randolph Churchill? Like just a split, like the handlebar mustache for a split second. Then I realized, no, it's George V, who of course looks like his cousin, Nicholas II. But I don't think I'd be the only person who upon very first glance thought it looked similar to Lord Randolph Churchill.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that in terms of the resemblance across the royal houses of Europe, I see that element more, the fact that there's such a strong resemblance between Tsar Nicholas and the Kaiser and George V, because of course all are related. And actually that relates to another element of what you see actually over the course of these three monarchs' reigns is the fall of a lot of other European royal houses, which is hugely destabilizing for this very established world order that I mentioned at the outset of Churchill's political career. So that shift, which happens over the course of these monarchs' reigns, impacts Churchill's view of the monarchy hugely.
Okay, all right. Let's move on, Catherine. That was a great first photo.
Thank you. So, let me just click to the next one.
And I have to say, I just saw a comment from Carol who says none of them look happy, which complicated royal families. So what's this? This is a great photo. So
this is Winston Churchill with the then Prince of Wales. So George V is on the throne at this point. His son, the future Edward VIII, is at this point the Prince of Wales. And the reason I've picked this image is because these are the first two where I'd say there is a genuine close friendship and relationship. So with the earlier monarchs, there is, as you would expect, a minister and a monarch dynamic. But actually, Churchill positions himself as an advisor to the Prince of Wales. So, for example, Prince Edward goes to Churchill for advice on speech writing and speech giving. So he becomes this sort of wise advisor to him. And there is a 20-year difference between the two men. And they are, you could say, quite similar characters as well. They run in the same social circles. So they are, you know, they do spend time together. And by the time this photo is taken, this is 1919, so they've known each other for 9-10 years by this point. And so the reason I picked this one is just to depict a genuine friendship between the two. I really like the photographs in this exhibition where it's almost like the camera isn't there. You're looking in on a private moment. And you can even see from Edward's body language, there's a slight kind of almost like a deferentialness to Winston Churchill at this point. And Winston Churchill in 1919, he's had a roller coaster of a career, really, by this point. So he's not, you know, he is far from, you know, a dead cert to one day reach the high offices of Chancellor of the Exchequer that he would in the late 20s and then Prime Minister after that. But even so, he is relied on by the Prince of Wales.
And this is 1919, you said?
Yes, it is, yes.
And how old would Edward VIII be, Prince of Wales?
So he's 25 in this photograph, and Winston Churchill is in his mid-40s,
Yeah.
which you wouldn't guess, actually. I don't think looks like there's a 20-year difference between them, but there is.
I think he looks pretty, he looks 25 to me. Churchill doesn't look that old. This is an incredible photograph, and I see what you're saying about the deference, the body posture.
Yes.
There's a question. Oh, it looks like it's this chat is actually very fascinating. But people are, so someone said, was the Prince of Wales as tall or shorter than Churchill? And then someone said he was standing on a step. So and sorry, Catherine, remind me, where was this photo taken? What building is this outside of? Do we know?
So this is 1919. So it just generally Whitehall. So
Yeah,
it's
okay.
yeah. So at this point, Churchill is Minister of Munitions still, I believe, at this point.
So I'm asking too many questions. Let's let's let the expert please go ahead.
Okay, so for the next one, if I just click that one, yes, lovely. This is one of my favorites. This is a very young Queen Elizabeth II, Princess Elizabeth, as she was, of course, at this time. And it's actually a photograph taken by her father. So this is a photograph taken by the Duke of York, future George VI. And she's only 2.5 years old. And the reason I've picked it is because this is the age she was when Churchill first meets her. So if you think about their relationship once she's become queen, she's known him since she was this age. And at this point, she isn't the heir to the throne because her father isn't the king. So, you know, Edward VIII should be king. And there's a really lovely quote when Winston Churchill meets the Queen at this age, where he says that she had an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant. And he wasn't making that observation looking at, in his mind, the future monarch, because she's not the heir to the throne. It's just an observation about a child. But I love that even he saw that air of authority in the young Queen.
Yeah, it's a beautiful photograph.
It is, absolutely. Yeah, it's really, really lovely. And like I said, I think those ones where it's just a natural moment is brilliant to have. And so in putting this image in, I've sort of positioned the Duke of York's very settled family life at this point in the late 1920s, which is then juxtaposed by the fact that Edward VIII remains a bachelor prince. So at this point, he's going out with a lady called Frida Dudley Ward, who is married. And she's also a good friend of the Churchills. She visits Chartwell several times. And then in the year after this photograph's taken, he meets Wallis Simpson. And he leaves Frida Dudley Ward and begins courting Wallis Simpson, which leads to the next image. So this is Edward VIII giving his abdication broadcast. So what's happened is that Edward VIII has come to the throne. He has declared he would like to marry the now divorced Wallis Simpson, so she is available to marry, but the government fiercely oppose the match. And essentially, Churchill puts himself on the wrong side of history. He has Edward VIII's back. As you saw from the photograph earlier, there is a genuine friendship there. But I think there's a number of reasons beyond that friendship. A lot of people go with a sort of hopeless romantic line of, Churchill wanted love to conquer all. And Churchill was a very romantic person, but I don't think that was what influenced his decision-making on this one. For me, there's two reasons. Firstly, as I said, you've got the royal houses of Europe have fallen. We've lost Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. And actually, it's not a foregone conclusion that the British monarchy will survive at this point. No one can guarantee that at this point. Spain's monarchy falls in 1931. So a constitutional crisis is not what Britain needs right now. And in addition to that, Churchill is on the backbenches politically. He's not been given a government position by the Prime Minister of the day, Stanley Baldwin. And there is some argument that Churchill thought it would be a good idea to oppose the government at that point. I personally think that it's sort of a combination of all those things. And what he did essentially was try and buy time for Edward VIII. He thought that it was quite possible Edward might lose interest in Wallis Simpson, just as he'd lost interest in Freda Dudley Ward. And was it worth overthrowing the monarch for someone that he might well lose interest in due course? One thing I hadn't realized before researching for this exhibition, but I think is fascinating, is that Churchill actually helps write Edward VIII's abdication speech. And
I didn't know that.
No, I didn't know that either. It's incredible, because that has since become one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. And so the fact that Churchill had a hand in that, I think just goes to show the breadth of the influence of his rhetoric, even beyond his own speeches.
My only comment on this, because I'm mindful of time, is for somebody who was committed to the monarchy and the empire, I'm always surprised that Churchill didn't advocate for the office, if you will, or the position in respect to the individual in this circumstance. I'm surprised he did decide to be on the wrong side of history, right? That always fascinates me. But he also was, as you know, a very loyal, committed person to friends.
Absolutely. And he's someone who politically would always sort of follow his own compass. What did he think was right? He wasn't someone who adhered to, the party line or the steer from the party whip. It was his gut instinct as to what was the right thing to do. And that gut instinct wasn't always right. And interestingly, just to show the next image, I love that on the day of George VI's coronation, which is what's being depicted here, this is the new royal family. During the coronation, Churchill turns to his wife Clementine, who had judged the mood of the country far better. She had thought that actually Edward should go. And so Churchill turns to Clementine and says, "You are right, I see now, the other one wouldn't have done." Problem is, by that point, Churchill has some serious fences to mend with the new monarch. Churchill respects and admires the former Duke of York, now George VI, but in being allied especially to Wallis Simpson, who was very much persona non grata with the new monarch, Churchill had some serious work to do to rebuild that relationship. And because George VI's father, George V, and his grandfather Edward VII had issues with Churchill earlier in his career when he was this zealous reformer, there was in some circles the view that he was unreliable. And I think that there's a really interesting quote from the Canadian Prime Minister in June 1939, where he says, George VI says, he would never wish to appoint Churchill to any office unless it were absolutely necessary in time of war. And that is said 3 months before Britain declares war on Germany.
Incredible. Please continue, Catherine.
Okay, so now we come to a scene of bomb-damaged Buckingham Palace. So Buckingham Palace, didn't manage to evade the impact of the Blitz. And there's a quote from Queen Elizabeth at the time where she says, in a way, she's glad because she can finally look the East End in the eye, because, you know, they too have suffered. And in terms of Churchill's early time as Prime Minister, after he's been appointed in May 1940, he has a bit of an uphill struggle, because the Queen and the King had both got on very well with Neville Chamberlain. They thought very, very highly of him, and both expressed deep regret at him having to leave that office. And both were also friends with Lord Halifax, who was another potential candidate for the role of Prime Minister at that time. So it wasn't the warmest or easiest of relationships. And another interesting way to think of it is, at this point, arguably the greatest crisis in British history, you could argue, in May 1940, you have a man who wasn't meant to be king, and you have a man who wasn't meant to be Prime Minister. And you have them both at the absolute forefront of this, you know, international disaster that is, you know, May 1940. And arguably the sort of conduct of war is dependent on them building bridges really, really quickly. And they do. So by the end of 1940, there is an actual genuine friendship there. And there's lovely notes written between the two in early 1941 where they're expressing deep appreciation of each other. And Churchill gets made Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, which is an office that can be bestowed by the King, which is a very long-standing office, essentially a ceremonial office tasked with defending the South Coast. But Churchill, as a historian, loves this. It's an absolutely brilliant thing to have. So that's what I've tried to depict in this photograph. And of course, they were having their meetings in Buckingham Palace. You know, there's a quote from Churchill says, "I have been greatly cheered by our weekly luncheon in poor old bomb-damaged Buckingham Palace." So they are still meeting in there and discussing the conduct of war.
Yeah, and the Cinque Port, that's the flag flying in his study, right, at Chartwell?
So we have the original Lord Warden of the Cinque Port flag, you're absolutely right, on the wall of the study, and we fly a replica of it over the house of Chartwell. And we are in fact just getting a new one, thanks to a very kind donation. And so we hope to have a new one flying for the Jubilee celebrations in June.
Your point about these two men, unexpected leaders at the time, is incredible juxtaposition. And they went from, you know, far apart to so close that they had to argue about landing on Normandy on June 6, 1944. And so they, yeah, it's just incredible. It's a very fascinating relationship between those two.
It is, definitely. And you're right, the debate about D-Day and whether or not Churchill should be there, and, you know, George VI knowing full well that there wasn't really an obvious successor that could step into that role at that point in time. So, you know, couldn't afford to have Churchill going to the beaches.
So please continue.
Okay, so the next image is Princess Elizabeth herself training with the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service. And this is her in 1945. So when war broke out in 1939, Princess Elizabeth was just 13 years old, and she and her sister, Princess Margaret, were evacuated to Windsor Castle for much of the war. And then towards the end of the war, she turns 18, she joins the ATS, and this is the women's branch of the British Army. And in doing so, she becomes the first female member of the royal family to become a full-time active member of the armed services. And what's an interesting comparison is that Churchill's youngest daughter, Mary, is very similar age, joins the ATS, and both Winston Churchill's daughter and Princess Elizabeth end up being promoted to the rank of junior commander, which is equivalent to a captain today. So there's a lovely synchronicity where Churchill can see his own daughter sort of joining up and progressing through the army as he sees Princess Elizabeth doing the same. Shall I carry on to the next one?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So this is a very famous image. This is probably one that a lot of you have seen. Oh, can you see it?
No, not, maybe just click again. It hasn't changed. There we go. There we go.
Oh, hang on. So now can you see it? Is it there now?
No, the one we see now is on the balcony.
Oh, that's about that. I want the balcony one. Yeah.
Yep, that's it. That's where we are.
Okay, great. So this is VE Day. This is the royal family and Sir Winston Churchill on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. And a lot of people think that Churchill is the first non-royal to be afforded this honour. Actually, Neville Chamberlain was given this honour when he came back from Munich declaring peace in our time. Churchill's one far more celebratory though, because at this point there are thousands gathering and cheering the royal family and their wartime prime minister. And this image meant so much to Winston Churchill that there is a copy that hangs on his bedroom wall at Chartwell, which is signed by all members of the royal family. And for anyone who is able to see Winston Churchill's bedroom, which you can see at Chartwell now if you book on a highlights tour on a weekday, at the end of the day, you'll see that the objects he surrounds himself with in his bedroom are arguably his absolute most cherished prized possessions. So the fact that this image features among them tells you a great deal about how much this moment meant to Winston Churchill.
And I know we'll get to every photo, but I just have to ask, what are the other items in his bedroom? Is it a photo of his father or a photo of his mother?
There's two photographs of his mother. Two of his father and a watercolor on tile of his mother and also a photograph of his mother. So there's 4 images of his parents around the bedroom. But yeah, there's some really, it's very, very telling, the things that make their way into his bedroom. Great,
please continue.
So this image is 1950. So I've picked this one to depict the years after the Second World War. At this point, Churchill is leader of the opposition, and we have Clement Attlee in the background, who is Prime Minister at this point of time. And what we see at this point is, because of her father, George VI's ill health, Princess Elizabeth, as she was at that point, takes on more and more royal duties. So she is stepping into that role, increasingly so as her father is suffering hugely, in combination with the strain of war, but also damage to his lungs, which means he has to have major surgery. And while he's recovering from that, Princess Elizabeth, like I said, takes on more and more royal duties. So that's what we see happening here, and her gradually moving into that role. And let's move on to the next one. This one, do you know what? With photographs, there's a really interesting process between quality of image and the story you want to tell. And I love this one so much that I forgave the fact that it's not quite as high resolution as some of the others. So this is 1951, and Elizabeth has just returned from a tour of Canada. By this point, Winston Churchill has been re-elected. So he had, throughout his career, always wanted to be a peacetime prime minister. So he'd had his moment in the Second World War, but he wanted a chance to lead in peace as well. So that's what he's doing at this point in terms of leading the government. And for me, this is another one of those moments where it's like the camera's not there. It's like you're looking in on a really private moment. And you can see the relationship between them, even though she's not monarch yet. They're not monarch and prime minister, but there's a genuine rapport and warmth between the two. I mean, she's got this huge smile on her face and she's clearly having a wonderful time. And that reflects something that she later said when she was asked who her favorite prime minister was. And she said, Winston, of course, because it was always such fun. And you can see that dynamic between the two in this image. So that's why I picked this one.
Quick question. Someone in the chat says, what was this event? Do you know the event from this photograph?
So it's celebrating her return from the tour. So it's a banquet.
Okay.
It's a banquet held in honor of her returning from her tour of Canada.
Wonderful.
So the next one. So this, for me, is an incredibly moving image. This is her returning from Kenya following the death of her father. And first of all, I just think it's such an iconic image, even just the way she's holding herself, her composure, and the way she's just looking out across, the land of which she is now monarch. And it's a hugely emotional time for her. When she had the anniversary of her accession a couple of weeks ago, she referenced that to her it was as important for the loss of her father as it was for her becoming queen. So you almost can't quite imagine the emotion going through her mind at that point, and yet she's so composed. She's already so regal in her demeanor. And as well as that, if you look at the foot of the stairs, the first person she's going to speak to when she steps onto British soil is Winston Churchill. He is her prime minister, and he is there to greet her on her return. So this is the moment when her life changes forever, and Winston Churchill is at the absolute forefront of that moment in time.
Yeah, I'll reiterate the sense of duty. He was completely in service to his monarchs for sure. So one question, someone wants to know who's the person standing next to Churchill. I think that's impossible to know unless it's identified in your photo.
I don't actually know off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I confess it's a harder one to make out because you haven't got the whole silhouette there.
Yeah, this is an incredible photo. This is my favorite of the bunch, but actually one of two. So, but continue.
Okay, so this next image is from the coronation luncheon. So this is an event that takes place the day before the coronation, and it is for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association branches. So you have representatives all over the world because they're all there for the coronation next day, so they haven't attended this lunch beforehand. And there's some lovely phrasing that Churchill uses at this moment in time to talk about the accession of Queen Elizabeth II. And he harks back to a second Elizabethan age, for example, so harking back to the Tudor Queen Elizabeth. And he also references the thrill that he looks forward to feeling in invoking the prayer and anthem "God Save the Queen" once more, because it seems very strange to us for "God Save the Queen" is our national anthem, but it had been "God Save the King" for virtually all of his parliamentary career so far. So, and the queens of this country are the ones under whose reign some of the most important moments in history have happened, and some of our longest serving monarchs are queens. So there was this sort of sense of renewal and excitement about this next chapter that awaited in our history. And Churchill, as a historian, not only knew that, I think he rather enjoyed having a front row seat at that change in chapter.
Incredible. Go ahead.
Okay, so this next image is the coronation itself. And when I was speaking to Top Photo to find a good image to represent the coronation, it's actually a really, really hard thing, because the photographers were given really specific places in Westminster Abbey in which they could be positioned. And also because it's not posed for in any way, it's an active, moving event. So you'll see, for example, some of the images around Her Majesty the Queen are blurred because you're just having to get it as it's happening. The reason I picked this particular angle is, and I don't know if I move my cursor, if you can see, if I do that. Yep. So there we have Winston Churchill, and in front of him we have his wife, Clementine. So the fact that they are placed so closely to the monarch at that point in time, that is literally a front row seat. So you can see just how important Churchill's role was at that point in time, that he has such proximity. And as with all long-standing traditional ceremonies pertaining to the monarch, proximity to the crown denotes importance. So Churchill is very much reflecting that level of seniority in proceedings.
Yeah, this would be a fun game to try to identify as many people as possible. But for another Zoom event, we'll do that. All right,
yeah, absolutely. That could be a whole one unto itself, I think. Analyzing this, it's photograph.
Like, where's Waldo? Just name all the important people. So go ahead.
Okay, so oh, hang on. Is that one there? So oh, hang on, I skipped one. Okay, so this one is the awaiting the Queen Mother at Waterloo Station. That's what we're seeing here. So the Queen Mother.
We see.
Oh
yeah. So, yeah. This is Churchill and Okay, perfect. And the kids.
Yes, yeah.
Yep.
So you have Queen Elizabeth and her two young children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne. And they are awaiting the Queen Mother, as I said. And I've picked this one because it's a really informal moment between the two. I had to pick one image from the whole exhibition to be what we call the sort of hero image, the one you use on all your marketing and your promotion. And it's the one that you use to sort of embody the whole display. And for me, this one does it perfectly because you can just see how well they get on. Do you know what I mean? So even aside from the moment in time that it's representing, which is they're both waiting at Waterloo Station, you have this lovely dynamic between the two where, you know, body language, smiles, eye contact, it's all there. You can see that their relationship as monarch and prime minister is a genuine friendship and there's a warmth there. And I once read an account where some of the members of staff from Buckingham Palace declared that you could always tell if it was a meeting with Churchill because of the amount of laughter coming from the room. So I think that's represented really beautifully in this image. And it's lovely that we start to see Prince Charles coming into these as well.
Yeah. Wonderful photo. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so this next one, this is the Garter Day procession. So Churchill had been offered the Order of the Garter by George VI and he declined. He was offered it originally in 1945 and declared, how can I possibly accept the Order of the Garter when the people of England have just given me the Order of the Boot? Because he had just been elected out of office at that point. So he didn't feel it appropriate to accept at that point. But then when Queen Elizabeth is on the throne, she renews the offer and he accepts. And he reportedly said to a friend at the time, I only accepted because I think she is so splendid, which I think is it's a lovely note about what
I never heard that.
Yeah, so it's a lovely thing to reflect on how much he admires her as an individual. The admiration is beyond that of monarch. It is the fact that she is so brilliant, which I absolutely love. Him becoming a Knight Companion of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, which is the full title, is something that meant a great deal to him. And what's lovely as well is that it's an honour that was bestowed on his daughter Mary in due course. So there's a family connection there.
That's right. Mary Soames, youngest child of Winston and Clementine, who was until her death in 2014 the patron of the International Church Society, who did incredible things for this organization. Is this photo at Windsor?
So yes, so the Garter Day procession happens at Windsor. So they are processing, I think, to St George's Chapel in the grounds of Windsor Castle at this point.
St George's Chapel, who saw a recent royal wedding a few years ago now, didn't it?
It certainly did, yes. I think it's seen a few recent royal weddings, but yes.
Okay, please move forward.
Okay, so this next image is the Queen returning from her first Commonwealth tour. So her first tour is really long. It's almost 6 months that she's away for. And this is the sort of essentially like the welcoming committee on her return is what you see here. And Churchill is clearly delighted on her return. He makes the most effusive speech, which declares, when the background of this formidable century rises in our minds, with all its struggles and achievements, the gleaming episode of the Queen's journey among her peoples, their joy in welcoming her, and the impact of her personality upon their visit, on their vast numbers, constitutes an event which stands forth without an equal in our records. So you don't get much more effusive than that on her returning from a tour. So no pressure at that point in time. You know, he's clearly setting the bar very, very high for his what he is foreseeing as the success of her reign. I also really love the fact that it's Prince Charles that we see shaking Churchill's hand here, and Princess Anne. He's beaming at him. He's absolutely, you can just see the sheer joy on his face, but also it's that you know, Churchill by this point has grandchildren of his own, and you know, all of whom remember very warmly their relationship with their grandfather. He's just really good with children, and so you can see that he's, you know, he's not sort of being stoic and upright. You know, he's properly sort of looking down and engaging with Charles, which I think is a really lovely sight to see.
Well, you know, as we No, for those who don't know, Churchill was an incredibly playful person and almost childlike in many ways. You know, saving the United Kingdom, not so much childlike, but in his personal life with his personal relationships, for sure.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And one of my favorite photographs of Churchill is him building a snowman at Chartwell and that sort of thing. So yeah, you're right. There is a really playful side to his character.
Building the snowman at Chartwell and sticking a cigar in his mouth. Is that right? Yeah,
yes, I think so. Yeah.
That's right. Okay, so 3 more photos. So please finish up for us, Catherine.
Yes, we are on the home straight now. So this image is of the farewell dinner at Downing Street. So I should say all those images we've been looking at most recently, he still holds the office of Prime Minister. And there is a dinner at Downing Street, which is on the eve of his retirement from the office of Prime Minister. He remains an MP, but this is him leaving that particular office. And the principal guests at this dinner are, of course, Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, who you can see if you look carefully in the doorway there. I love his facial expression. It's very him.
Yeah, he too is beaming.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see that again, his character just coming out in these images.
Yeah.
So there was a toast that was given at this farewell dinner from Churchill to the Queen, where he says, "Never have the august duties which fall upon the British monarch been discharged with more devotion than in the brilliant opening to your Majesty's reign." And this is, don't forget, the 6th monarch that he served. So for him to be saying that really is putting her at the absolute, top end of monarchs who he's worked with in terms of his admiration for them. And like I said, he's now had a political career that has spanned from the reign of Queen Victoria. So the fact that he holds Queen Elizabeth II in such high regard, to me, it just says a great deal. And I love the fact that Clementine's in this image as well, because she was a lifelong support and champion of Winston's throughout his career. And the fact that she's there in this moment as well with Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Philip is why I picked this image.
Wonderful.
So 2 to go. So this is now 10 years on. So this is Winston Churchill's funeral, which was held at St. Paul's Cathedral as part of a state funeral, which was an honour bestowed by the Queen herself. The monarch has to say if someone has a state funeral. So it was her wish that he should. And the planning had been underway for Churchill's funeral since the late 1950s. It had the code name Operation Hope Not. And there's a number of really kind of symbolic elements. So the reason St. Paul's Cathedral was picked as the church was because of the iconic reference to, St. Paul's must be saved at all costs during the height of the Blitz. So that's why that cathedral is picked. And for me, this image of them on the steps of St. Paul's, this is them watching the coffin being taken away, I should add. So that's what they're all looking at in this image. And you can tell there's a genuine sadness there. They're genuinely affected by that moment. And the Queen actually broke royal protocol for Churchill's funeral in that normally she is the last person to enter any event that she attends. But in this instance, she gave that honour to the Churchill family. So, there was remarkable moments in terms of royal protocol that went by the wayside because of her relationship with Winston Churchill. I also love the fact that Prince Philip is saluting. That's again a wartime reference. He served in the Second World War, and so that is him paying homage to the wartime leader being taken away on his final journey up to Oxfordshire, where he was laid to rest.
Yes, this is one of my 2 favorites. It's an incredibly moving, and like you said, it's not posed. It's a snapshot in time that is incredibly moving.
I think so. And you can see if you look at the Queen's face, even you can see she's genuinely affected by that moment. And
wow. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I've got one more to go. And I could have ended the exhibition here, actually. This would be a really natural endpoint to that discussion around Churchill and his relationship with the British monarchs. with a particular focus on the Queen. But there was one more I wanted to include, which actually relates to an event that takes place 8 months after Churchill's death. So this is after the 25th Battle of Britain service in Westminster Abbey, and a polished marble green stone is unveiled. And it's been installed at the request of both Her Majesty the Queen and Parliament. And if you go into Westminster Abbey, this green stone is pretty much the first thing you see. And if you think about it, you're entering a building that's been a place of worship for almost 1,000 years. And this memorial is at the very forefront of when you enter. And this is the unveiling ceremony. So you have the Queen, if I get my cursor here on the left hand side, and we have over 40 members of the Churchill family present at this unveiling. And the inscription at the top, it reads, "Remember Winston Churchill." And I think that is such a simple message. That was something that would have been signed off both by Her Majesty the Queen and Parliament. And that's how they wanted him referencing in this iconic building of British history, just the words, "Remember Winston Churchill." And so that's how I wanted to end this exhibition. So there we go.
Wonderful, Catherine. A few questions about this photo.
Mm-hmm.
You said 10 months later or 10 years later?
Oh, no, sorry. It was 8 months, 8 months after Churchill's death.
So if, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you look your eyes at the Duke of Edinburgh and go directly to the right, there must be Clementine standing in the front row.
Yeah, so in my, yes, so if I move my cursor.
Yeah,
so
is that Randolph?
Yes, it is, yes.
Wow.
And then you've got Sarah just slightly further along.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that's Sarah. Wow, that's incredible. Remember Winston Churchill. I love what you said about how simple it is. Do you know who designed that piece? I
don't know who the designer is. No, actually, I confess it would have been, someone by royal appointment, I would imagine, for such an iconic installation in Westminster Abbey.
Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. Shall I stop sharing my screen now?
Yeah, stop sharing your screen. We have a few questions, and people are using the chat. You can also use the Q&A. We have about 10 more minutes if people want to stick around. I'm going to read off one. It's from Elliot Clark. Must be our friend Elliot Clark. After the death of her father, do you think Queen Elizabeth II looked at Churchill as a father figure for support and advice?
I mean, I think only Her Majesty the Queen could answer that question. I think that Churchill, he fell into that elder statesman role, of which there are models earlier in British history. So, for example, when Queen Victoria came to the throne at a similarly young age, the then Prime Minister Lord Melbourne sort of fell into this wise elder statesman role. So that's, I think, what Churchill is emulating more than anything.
There's a few, I'm just looking through the chat, a lot of great comments and questions. There was one person who represented the U.S. at Churchill's funeral. It certainly wasn't the sitting president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He did not go, which caused a furor. I know there was one man named Lloyd Hand who was there, who was actually, Lloyd Hand is still alive. He wrote a story for Finest Hour a few years ago. But yeah, that was a glaring omission, Stanley Weinstein, who asked the question. Many heads of states were there. You saw de Gaulle in that photo. Mm-hmm. Lyndon Johnson was not there. Let me, hang on. So some of these are more historical questions, but Catherine, you're our guest, so I'm going to ask them anyways. Earl Warren. I don't think at the time, but was Supreme Court Justice and Governor of California was there. So Stephen Shore asks, I've heard that Churchill never followed any of the advice given to him by King George VI. That is surely not true. But he says, if this is true, are there any known examples of which advice was rejected? But can you go into a little bit further about that relationship that blossomed between them, the two, that you know of?
So it's an interesting one. So there weren't any really major decisions around the conduct of war where George VI changed Churchill's mind. But like Justin said, there were moments, for example, should Churchill actually be present the D-Day landings, where Churchill wanted to go and George VI convinced him not to. So there were some decisions where he impacted, but not big ones about kind of, military strategy or anything like that. What was the other part of the question?
Well, you kind of answered it in terms
Okay.
of like what if there were any exceptions to that comment. There's a lot of discussion about Edward VIII. Someone says Churchill gives up his friendship with Edward VIII after George VI becomes king. I don't know if that's necessarily true.
No, that's not. They remain friends. So, for example, another thing I didn't realize before researching this was that the Churchills spent their 40th wedding anniversary with the Duke of Windsor and with his wife. So, no, they remained friends. But Churchill, he was very. He essentially didn't campaign, really. I think that, for example, when war broke out, Edward VIII would have loved to have come back and had some kind of role after Churchill was made Prime Minister, and Churchill didn't push for that. Edward VIII, by then the Duke of Windsor, ended up being offered the governorship of, where was it? Was it Bahamas? Governorship of the Bahamas, I think. So
yeah, that's right.
Actually, it's kind of give him a role where he feels like he's doing something, but send him really far away. So I think Churchill at that point knew that his absolute priority, in terms of the importance of that relationship during the war, really, he had to give due credence and deference to George VI by that point, even though that a friendship remained with Edward, but that wasn't going to influence his conduct.
There's a question here. This is from Stephen Sells. Could Churchill have a blind spot regarding Wallace Simpson, with Churchill being half American and a frequent traveler to the USA? If I may answer as an American, and knowing a decent amount about Churchill, I don't think so, because of his complete dedication to the monarchy and to his personal relationships. I mean, I don't know if he had a blind spot, but I don't think him being half American played a role in that whatsoever. Although he was, American file. I don't think that would have happened. But here's an interesting question, Chris Calvert. Is it true that we now have tanks because of Churchill actually having first commissioned them as Minister of Munitions in World War I? This is a great story, and it's more nuanced, but what's your take on that?
So Churchill certainly championed the development of the technology. Whether or not you can credit him with sort of inventing them, but he certainly was at the forefront of thinking of that point in time that there needed to be some sort of solution to trench warfare, and he was, I think, shown early designs and thought very highly of them and championed their development and investment in their development. So that would be my answer. Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, Winston Churchill has a long track record throughout his life of championing new technology. He was a huge fan of flying when that was first invented, and then he got in an almost fatal accident. And he promised his wife he would never fly again, at least alone in some unsafe airplane. The tank. Thinking of, I mean, he had that special. I don't know if you've read Giles Milton's Churchill's Ungentlemanly Warfare. If you've read that book, it's about him encouraging and funding during the war research on very specific weapons, like I'm totally blanking. It's those different types of tanks and the different types of the one that would be a minesweeper, the one that could float. So Churchill was incredibly interested in these things. So yeah, I think by all means he didn't create the tank, but he definitely advocated for their inclusion in the First World War, excuse me. Okay, I will say, let's do one last question.
By the way, I should say as well, thank you so much for all these comments. And I was looking earlier when everyone was saying where they tuned in from around the world, and it's absolutely brilliant you've been able to join us. And I'm loving the chat. It's brilliant.
Yeah, the chat's great. So thank you all. And I want to end with a question from YH Wadadyare, who asks, is it true that Mr. Churchill himself regarded his greatest achievement in life was, quote, convincing his wife to marry him, or is this just hearsay? He was absolutely dedicated to his wife. I think I've seen that quote. Do you know of this?
That is a genuine Churchill quote, and I would recommend husbands worldwide follow that steer. Behind every great man is a great woman. I firmly believe.
I mean, and I will read. I've said this so many times. Churchill's relationship with his wife is something to aspire to, truly. And you know, there are many people on this call may know the story of her writing him and admonishing him when he was a prime minister in World War II, giving him the advice he needed about treating his colleagues in a poor way, and giving him the perspective that he didn't have. That was one of many times that she gave him incredible advice that was needed, for sure.
I would just echo that with, I think that actually a huge number of political figures even today would credit those around them with the support needed to be able to work at that level of pressure. Definitely. Yeah. So for Winston Churchill, Clementine was absolutely vital in that role.
Yeah, and I'll end. So there was a comment by Bill. Thanks for commenting. Maybe not so much his relationship with his children. Winston Churchill was dedicated to his children, and maybe to a fault in many ways. And you know, their individual lives are their own individual lives, but the way that he treated his children was atypical to the way that he was brought up, and others in his time are brought up, for sure.
Yeah, and I listen. I'm seeing in the chat people saying beside every great man there's often a great woman. Yeah, let's make it that. I think that's definitely, it should be beside. I'm happy to.
Not behind. I fully agree with you.
Yeah, it definitely should be.
Well, Katherine, thank you. We'll have you on another time. Thanks so much for putting this exhibition together, and thanks for sharing it with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me this evening. Thank you everyone for joining.
All right, take care, everyone.